What's up guys, welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. If you want to support me, you can now follow me on Patreon. Not only is it the best way to help out the channel, additionally you'll get more say in what decks I cover. Special shout out to all of my high contributing patrons. Newsome, you rock. Additionally, you can always use that TCGplayer link in the description down below to help support the channel. Now let's get into today's Deck Tech with Don Andreas. And now this is the Patreon voted weekly Deck Tech. So again, if you want to become a part of that, become a patron. Now let's get into what this deck wants to do, and we have two abilities here, and you kind of want to build differently judging on what ability you go for. If you go to try to trigger both of these as much as possible, you might end up with a split deck. So I was left with the choice: do we want to try to steal our opponent's creatures as much as possible, or do we want to just start exiling cards from the top of our opponent's libraries and get a ton of instant and sorcery cards while generating a ton of treasure tokens? And I kind of went for mass steal effects. So whenever we are stealing our opponent's creatures, we're stealing a lot of them all at once and trying to take our opponents out. And then I went for a lot of incremental ways to get instant and sorcery spells or non-creature spells off the top of our opponent's library. So in short, early game, we get a lot of incremental value off of our opponents, and then late game, we're going to mass reanimate all of our opponent's creatures as well as ours and go for the win. Now, I think this is going to be pretty powerful because we are going to be throwing in a Reanimator subs theme in there, because stuff like Brain Stealer Dragon is not cheap. So it's going to be way more efficient to do Grixis stuff, wheel a lot, fill our opponent's graveyards as well as our graveyards, and then we can pick and choose from everybody's graveyard what we want to reanimate. So now we're getting insane value. We get a lot of access to our opponent's cards because we have access to our opponent's graveyard, and then we're just going to get a ton of value off of our commander because of all of the treasure tokens. So if that sounds like a deck tech you want to get into, let's get into it. Let's kick it off by talking about our theft effects, because that's 90% of what this deck wants to do. Night Veil Spectre, Thief of Sanity, and Nashi are going to be very impactful low to the ground creatures that come down early and start stealing spells from our opponents. Notably, creatures, instant, sorceries, doesn't matter. These guys are going to give us access to everything. Dothy Voidwalker, also very low to the ground, comes down early and can be very impactful. Our early game goal is just to generate as much treasure tokens as possible to ramp us into those bombs. Mnemonic Betrayal, very late game card that gives us access to our opponent's graveyards, and we can just start casting spells and storming off from there. Cunning Rhetoric can kind of do two things in the deck. One, it just gives us free spells, and the other thing it does is kind of incentivize our opponents not to attack us. Rod of Absorption, kind of like a Dothy Voidwalker, right? But we get to cast everything under it as long as we pump enough mana into it. This card can generate a ton of treasure tokens and just honestly a ton of value. Wand of Wonder, another solid value engine. You can actually end up netting mana off of this as long as you roll enough, and 9 times out of 10 it just breaks even because of our commander, right? If we cast 2 non-creature spells with this, we get 4 treasure tokens. Now they are tapped, but next turn untapping with 4 treasure tokens, pretty big. Ensnared by the Mara, this is just literally an Atali trigger. Really solid. And if our opponents take damage, they take damage. We'll take that. Stolen Strategy does exactly that. Just starts stealing cards from the top of our opponent's library every turn. Bribery can just dig deep into our opponent's library and grab a creature. Dazzling Sphinx is another solid card because it cannot whiff. We really love creatures in this deck that cannot whiff. Deluxe Dragster. Remember, there is a wheel strategy in this deck, so we expect everybody's graveyard to have some goodies in them, and Deluxe Dragster is just a solid way to cast those goodies for free. Plarg, another solid way to start casting our opponent's spells for free. We like free spells. We are also going to run the OG Atali just for some free value. Valky, God of Lies. Casting this for the Planeswalker side, yes, very expensive, but remember, we are generating a ton of treasure tokens in this deck, so I could see us getting there. And then we get access to that Broken Emblem, and we can start exiling up to 4 cards a turn, giving us access to a ton of cards and just giving us a lot of options. Rexel, another solid beater that grabs cards from our opponent's graveyard and starts casting them for free. Arvinox, now this guy does take some setup, but he's going to be massive whenever he does become a creature. And then we're just going to get free value on top of a 9/9 beater. I will take that. Elder Brain, this guy gives us a ton of options, honestly just kind of very annoying to play against, but that's kind of what this deck is. Brain Stealer Dragon, not only does this guy give us a ton of options because we are exiling a ton of cards with this guy, he also just starts dealing damage to our opponents whenever we start casting their spells. It's kind of an FU on top of an FU, you gotta love it. Now let's talk about the other part of our commander, because yes, while some of those effects do allow us to cast our opponent's creatures, it doesn't do that on mass scale. So we are running Mob Rule. This is a solid way to steal a lot of our opponent's creatures and just start taking players out. Call for Aid. Now this one is limited in the fact that you can't attack the player you steal the creatures from, but again, in a scenario where, hey, we want to take a player out, I could see this card doing that very easily. Rise of the Dark Realms, this is one of our game enders, right? Now we're able to grab all of those creatures in our opponent's graveyards and throw them onto the battlefield under our control. Insurrection, another game ender here. Remember, these cards are expensive, but our commander does generate a ton of value and a ton of treasure tokens, so I could definitely see us getting there. Let's go over the recursion package in this deck. 9 times out of 10, I really don't want to be casting those bombs straight up, so recurring them is going to be a solid option. Another thing to note about our recursion package is notice how much of them target a graveyard, not our graveyard. That way we can even reanimate our opponent's bombs if we want to do that. Reanimate, notably a graveyard, right? We can target anything and just throw it onto the battlefield. Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead, and Necromancy are all also going to make this deck super solid, target any creature, and they're just very cheap reanimation effects. Lich Knight's Conquest, now this does only work for our creatures, but now we can take all of those treasure tokens and turn them into, I don't know, Brain Stealer Dragons. I'm into that. Breach the Multiverse, this one gets us a creature from everybody's graveyard, so now we'll end up with 4 creatures on our side of the field, pretty busted. Sepulchral Primordial, this one grabs creature cards from our opponent's graveyards and puts them into play under our control. Again, we have a lot of ways to utilize our commander's first ability, but we are really focused around generating those treasure tokens. Agadeem's Awakening, also going to be super solid. Late game, when we generate a lot of mana, we have a lot of treasure tokens active, we can just sack them all, cast a massive Agadeem's Awakening, and reanimate a good portion of our graveyard. Getting into the core of the deck, we are running Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots to protect our commander or any bombs we have on the battlefield that we don't want removed. Prosper Tomebound. There is a lot of ways to cast spells from exile with this deck, so now we're going to be netting treasure tokens whenever we do that. This can be incredibly busted and result in us storming off, having a huge turn now that we have access to untapped treasure tokens, right? My man Alf is also going to make an appearance. Again, we are casting a ton of spells from exile, so being able to double up on them just seems like a no-brainer. Professional Facebreaker and Grim Hireling. A lot of our creatures in this deck do have a form of evasion, and if they don't have a form of evasion, they're just massive or our opponent's creatures. So they will have a form of evasion because of our commander. Now we just have another way to generate a lot of treasure tokens. Notably, Grim Hireling, Professional Facebreaker, they both trigger when you deal combat damage to a player. So Grim Hireling can net you up to 6 treasure tokens, and Professional Facebreaker can net you up to 3. Just wanted to clear up any confusion there. Mizzix's Mastery is going to be solid in the deck. If we do wheel away any of our bombs, like, I don't know, Rise of the Dark Realms, it's going to be super solid to cast this for 4 mana and then have a 4 mana Rise of the Dark Realms. This is just going to be another way to make sure that the deck is resilient. Relic of Sauron and Faithless Looting. Sometimes those bombs end up in your hand early game and we need cards to get them out of our hand and into our graveyard. Faithless Looting and Relic of Sauron can make that happen. Passionate Archaeologist, again, we're casting a lot of cards from exile, so this is going to deal a lot of damage to our opponents. Moving on to card advantage, we are running Phyrexian Arena and Black Market Connections. In decks where you're running a lot of mass draw effects, it's just super solid to have some consistent draw effects as well. These cards never really feel bad, especially Black Market Connections. The fact that it ramps you and gives you card advantage is just busted. Jessica's Will is also going to make an appearance here. Not only does it synergize with casting pulling stuff from exile. Additionally, we have a lot of bombs, so anytime I'm running a reanimation strategy, this is just going to be an auto include because it can ramp you into those massive creatures. Then we have our wheel effects with Reforge the Soul, Wheel of Misfortune, Jace's Archivist, Windfall, and Whispering Madness. I especially love Whispering Madness because that Cypher ability is just busted. You're going to keep willing over and over again, filling everybody's graveyard, which is exactly what this deck wants to do. The ramp in the deck is super simple, so I won't bore you with it. We have all of the Signets, Wayfarer's Bauble, and Soul Ring. Moving on to removal, we have our Counterspell package with Arcane Denial, Swan Song, An Offer You Can't Refuse. Our single target removal package with Pongify, Chaos Warp, Feed the Swarm, and then our mass board wipe effects with Cyclonic Rift and Blasphemous Act. In closing, I'm super excited for this commander, guys. I've always wanted to run Brainstealer Dragon, the Elder Brain, all of these theft effects in a deck that makes sense, and this is the perfect commander for it. Grixis Steal Your Shit is finally here, and it's going to be mean. Again, guys, just to reiterate, this is the weekly voted deck tech for the Patreons. If you want to become a patron and become a part of these weekly deck votes, the link is in the description down below. As always, thank you to my patrons, especially my high contributing ones, Newsome and Chicken Salad. You guys are amazing. I appreciate you guys, as well as all of my other patrons. You guys are amazing. As always, I hope this helped you in your deck building endeavors, and I will see you in the next one.